Now that we have all of the HTML in place, let's turn to our CSS. And we're going to start with laying this out with our mobile dimension of the website. So one of the things that I'm struck by here as I start to work on this system immediately is the following. I have this mixed media and Annie Reinke listed right after that. And if you notice, there's a big gap in between them and they kind of look similar. The font is slightly smaller. But if we map this to a trend that we see right now in the design industry, often the little text on the top, that mixed media, will be displayed at a smaller font and it will be all in uppercase. And then after that, we'll have Annie Reinke, which will be in larger letters. So let's fix our styling here so it looks closer to that. So we're going to start here with artists, H4. And the way we can style this is pretty simple. We'll just say text, transform, uppercase. And then we'll say our font weight is normal. And then finally, our font size will be 0.8 rem. And that will get us to a tiny uppercase font that is not bolded. Remember, of course, it's bold by default. All of the headings are coming from your browser style sheet. The gap in between mixed media and Annie Reinke is caused by margin, and that margin happens both on the H4 and on the H3. All of the headings have some default margin associated with it. Be aware that when two margins intersect inside of your style sheet, they don't add together. They actually collapse into a single margin. This is a really important feature if you think about paragraphs, a series of paragraphs. We don't want to have a giant double space in between paragraphs. We want to have the same type of spacing in between them. So as two margins meet, they do collapse. So here on my H4, if I set the margin to 0, we won't see anything collapse here at all. It will look exactly the same, but stuff has happened. We've actually turned off the margin. The top margin here is coming now from the bottom of the H2. The margin that's underneath of the text for mixed media is coming from the top of the H3. So let's set that up as follows. Artists, H3. We're going to say margin top of 0.3 ems. We could set that to 0 if you wanted. If you just set it to a straight 0, it looks a little bit tight. So I've set it to 0.3 ems, which gives us a little bit of breathing room between those. That's an art decision, and you can change that however you like. Now that we've got that in place, let's focus on styling the cards themselves and the content inside of those cards. So let me make the visual side of this a little bit smaller. Just for fun, we could start with Flexbox. And so we'll work with the article wrap portion of our HTML. Remember, that is the div that wraps around all of the articles that we're working with here. And so we'll set that up, article wrap. And we'll say display flex. We'll say flex flow, because of course, by default, Flexbox will very helpfully set that all up as a series of columns inside of a row. That's not what we wanted a mobile dimension. So we'll say our flex flow is a column wrap. And then the gap will be 1 rem in between each one of those columns. So that just sets everything up going here horizontally down the page. Meh, so far so good. But wouldn't it be more interesting if we made this a little bit better? Part of the problem with having these giant images is that it makes the page very long for scrolling here on mobile. So wouldn't it be more fun if we had a smaller image with the text next to it? That would be kind of cool looking, and it wouldn't be all that hard to do when we leverage grid. So we have a basic layout here for our mobile layout. We have exactly what you would expect in a mobile dimension. We have our HTML and our images all stacked on top of each other really nicely. The images look great. They're nice and big. They're easy to see. but it does make for a long scrolling web page. Wouldn't it be nice if instead we had a 2-column layout on mobile and we could have an image taking up one of those columns, and next to it we could have all of the text? That may not look possible with what we have here, but thanks to Grid, this becomes a really easy layout to do. So let's set that up. So now the articles will wind up being our containers for all of the elements inside of it. So if we just take a quick peek inside of one of our articles here, you see that we have an H4, an H5, an image, and 2 paragraphs. That winds up being 5 elements that are children of the article. So in our layout here, as we plan it, we'll set this up as our article wrap, article, and then we're going to tell it to display as grid. And we're going to give it 2 columns, grid template columns of 1FR, 1FR, and then 5 rows, grid template rows, repeat, parentheses, 5, auto. So what will happen here is that by default, Grid is going to assign each element inside of the card its own row. So there we go. We have 1 element here, each inside of this card. And we've called for 2 columns. So what Grid has done is it put the heading in one, the image in the other, the text in the other, and the visit the website in the other. So we're just sort of alternating as we go on down the page here. We need to clean that up a little bit as well. So let's add to this more styles. Article wrap, article star. Remember, star is the universal selector, so we're saying that for all of the elements inside of an article, inside of our class of article wrap, do the following. We're going to say we want to put everything in grid column 2/3. So we're going to put everything over in the second column. See how the page jumps, everything goes over to the second column, which is great. And I'm also going to turn off the margin on the top, margin top of 0. That way things will tighten up in their spacing a little bit, which you'll see why here in just a moment. Then we'll make an exception to this rule for our images. So for article wrap, image, article image, then we're going to say we want a grid column of 1/2. So we want the images over on the left-hand side. So there it is. And it's going to put it in the row that most closely matches to the just the regular flow of the HTML. So it sort of looks like it's in the middle and the spacing is all wonky. The way we fix that is by saying then our grid row will be 1/6. And what that will do is have our image span over all 6 of our, or all 5 of our rows, and the content here now will snap up together and compact itself very, very nicely on the right-hand side, which is totally awesome and amazing. We probably need a little bit more gap here in between our article wraps and our columns, so let's add that. It's looking a little bit crowded over there. So I'm going to say a gap here in my article wrap article of 0 and then 1 rem. And that'll put some space there in between our image and the text. So that's pretty cool. That gives us the image next to the text. The HTML order is what it is. And we have a lovely layout here for mobile dimensions. It starts to get a little bit big as we get larger, so let's deal with that by writing some more media queries. So here at media, with a min width of 650 pixels, and our article wrap, we're going to say once again, display grid. This overrides the earlier declaration we had for Flex, as in Flexbox. Now we're going to tell it to display as grid, and then we can say our grid template columns are repeat 2, comma, and then of course we can use our friend min-max. Min-max 10 pixels, comma, 1 FR. So if you're not familiar with min-max, this is something you can include inside of CSS Grid. This is designed to make sure that your grid cells are going to look are good and they don't get too entirely small. It is possible that your grid cells shrink down so small that they just look terrible. So this is a technique that Chris Coyer has described on his CSS Tricks website. And so this is something that you can incorporate anywhere along the way. I haven't done so in the grid course to this point, mostly because I wanted you to get familiar with the notation. This is something else you can add on as a layer of security to make sure your cells don't get too small. So if we widen this page, now we're going to wind up with 2 columns. And you'll see here that we have a very lovely layout here at tablet dimensions. But we can now do one additional level of craziness here when we get to desktop and completely change the look of this site again. So here, so we'll say at media and min width. You probably want to say something like 1,000 pixels on your end. I'm going to say something like 800 pixels here because I have a smaller screen and limited size that I'm working with. And so here, let's change up our display again with article wrap. And I'm going to say my grid template columns are going to be repeat 4, comma, and then min-max. Inside of this, 10 pixels, comma, 1 FR. So now I'm telling Grid to set us up with 4 columns instead. So that's the way it looks right now. Those pictures are a little bit small. So let's clean that up a little bit. When we go to our article wrap article, now we'll say our grid template columns. So remember, this is inside of the article. Previously, we've had 2 columns, one with the image, one with everything else. Now I'm going to change that to simply 1 column, 1 FR. That's all I want. You could do a min-max on that too if you want. Min-max. Maybe it's a minimum of 100 pixels, comma, 1 FR, something like that. It doesn't always have to be 10 pixels. It could also be ems or rims or percents or viewport widths or whatever makes sense. I just happen to be using pixels here. Okay, then we need to specify our rows again. So our grid template rows, repeat 5, comma, auto, whoops. Auto. So that's how that's looking. And we can set up our gap with that. Zero, 1M. And then now the last part of this is to rearrange what we have here and get the image back into the same location as our text. So we can set that up as follows. We'll say our article wrap article star. In other words, for all of the elements, we want them to occupy our grid column of 1/2. Okay, make sure that they all occupy the same column. That's a good start. And then for the image itself, if you like it this way with the image at the top, you can absolutely do that. Or you could rearrange this. Article image. Here we might say something like our grid column is definitely still 1/2. Our grid row, though, if you want it to go back to its original location in the source code, so after the headings, we would just say auto. And that will move the image to where it would normally occur in the source order, right after the headings as we had it before. And we could also give that a bit of margin on the bottom of 1 rem. So we give it a little bit of spacing here on the page. So now we have a wild and crazy layout here where we've got 4 columns with headings on the top and images in the middle here at the desktop. When we go to our tablet dimension, we wind up with 2 main columns, each of which with 2 sort of separate columns, the image on the side, the text next to that. And then when you narrow this up even further, we have 2 nice columns with the text on one side and the image on the other. So the image is always big and visible. Very important when you're talking about artists. If you wanted to take this to the next level, you could do something interesting like giving background colors here on some of the cells, maybe not all of them. You could do some styling with the link to visit the websites. Maybe those would turn into some kind of button. You could definitely do fun things here with the fonts. We worked with a single Arial font here. It's pretty vanilla looking. So if you added some more interesting contrasting fonts, you could wind up making this look more interesting as well. You could add some border radius or a border on the image itself to jazz that up a bit. There's all kinds of things that you can do with cards to take the layout that I've just given you here to the next level and make a really exciting looking web page.